All right, this is our weekly paper that applies some of the concepts from the lecture to some practical problem in resource conservation or environmental protection. And in this case, the practical problem is global warming, the increase in average atmosphere and ocean temperature across the Earth as a result of the greenhouse effect caused by the consumption of fossil fuels. So how does this question or this problem relate to what we've been talking about? We've been talking about adaptation, natural selection, the idea that you need, in order for evolution by natural selection, you need variation, you need heritability of that variation, and you need effects on fitness caused by that variation. Well, all three of those are in evidence here in this paper. And the concern is there enough variation in fish populations for species to respond to the increasing temperatures? When those temperatures increase to levels beyond their thermal tolerance, if the temperatures are above their thermal tolerance, can they evolve in response to become more tolerant of warmer temperatures? Well, in order for them to evolve to become tolerant of warmer temperatures, they need to have variation in the population. Variation in heat tolerance, number one. Number two, that variation has to be heritable. And number three, that variation needs to allow them to overcome those increases in temperature. So this paper describes an experiment in the aquarium, in the lab, in which they tested the hypothesis that those three components exist in a population of wild-caught zebrafish. So in this population that they brought into the aquarium in the lab, they artificially selected fish that were high in their tolerance of increasing temperatures, high in their thermal tolerance. And they also selected for fish that were lower in their thermal tolerance. So they had two different lines of selection in fish to see if they could evolve higher thermal tolerance and also to see if they could evolve lower thermal tolerance in the lab as a result of artificial selection. So in order for them to evolve, that variation had to exist in the population, it had to be heritable, and it had to allow them to tolerate higher temperatures or not tolerate higher temperatures, depending on which selection line they were in. Right, so the authors collected about 5,000 fish from West Bengal, India in 2016, brought the fish to an aquarium facility at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and they allowed them to breed as they naturally would to create a parental generation that was used for the experiments. Temperature was kept at around 26 degrees, well aerated water. Larvae were fed 3 times a day using zebra feed and live Artemia species, which is a crustacean. Here's how they measured thermal tolerance in the fish. This is the CT max test. So they heated the water by 0.3 degrees per minute. So it was a slowly heated water, and they put 10 to 15 fish in the heating tank, which the water was increasing, the temperature was increasing, and watched the fish continuously and monitored the temperature continuously and until the fish exhibited behavior consistent with loss of equilibrium, which is defined as uncontrolled and disorganized swimming behavior for at least 3 seconds. And that was an indication of the limits of their thermal tolerance. As soon as they started to swim like that, the assumption was this fish has reached its limit of thermal tolerance. Right, so they performed this test on all the fish, every generation. Some fish tolerate tolerated a high increase in temperature, some were less tolerant. And so they separated out the fish and put them in separate bins depending on their thermal tolerance as exhibited in this test. Then out of the resulting fish, they chose three treatments, or three treatment groups, the control group, and then the group that had the highest thermal tolerance, and the group that had the lowest thermal tolerance. And then they allowed each of those three groups to mate in the aquarium to produce the next generation. And then they performed the same tolerance tests on the next generation, took out the highest thermal tolerance, the lowest thermal tolerance, and kept the control lines going. Mated those groups again for the next generation, did it all over again, and did this for 6 generations. So they had 3 lines. They had a control line with no selection, and they had an up selection for thermal tolerance, up selection line, and then they had a low selection line, a downward selection line for thermal tolerance. So they're artificially selecting for higher thermal tolerance and for lower thermal tolerance, and they had several lines within each of those 3 groups. So the question, was there variability? Was there heritability? And did they achieve an evolutionary change after this selection? And the answer is yes. So here we've got the yellow lines here. These are generation. This is generation on the x-axis, upper thermal tolerance on the y-axis, the response to the CT max test. Yellow lines are the up-selected lines. Blue lines are the down-selected lines. And the green is the controls. So over time, selection for higher thermal tolerance showed a response. The average thermal tolerance increased over time in the up-selected lines. In the down-selected lines, as predicted, the average thermal tolerance decreased over time, much greater than in the up-selected lines. And the controls stayed roughly the same. And that's the A graph here. And the B graph is expressing these changes relative to the control. So now all these dotted lines are just plotted as the 0 point here. So relative to the controls, the up-selected lines finally increased towards the end of the experiment, but the down-selected lines increased immediately and to a higher negative magnitude here. So if you do a regression to estimate heritability, like we'll be doing in the lab this week, the up-selected lines showed a heritability of 0.1, and the down more than double that, 0.24. So the heritability indicates the amount of variation, the amount of heritable variation that's in the population and has a potential to respond to selection. So there's a smaller amount of variability for increasing thermal tolerance than there is for decreasing thermal tolerance. There's quite a large variability for decreasing thermal tolerance and a large potential for evolving reduced thermal tolerance, lower heritability for increasing thermal tolerance, and lower potential for evolution of increased thermal tolerance from these regressions. And then they had a fourth group, which is this group in which they, before selecting for increased thermal tolerance, they acclimated the fish to higher temperatures. Okay, so they kept the fish in tanks of higher temperatures until they stopped exhibiting erratic behavior. So they assumed that the fish acclimated themselves to those higher temperatures. And once they were acclimated, then they also selected for higher thermal tolerance in those acclimated groups. And that didn't really show much of a response. So it didn't seem to show that acclimation really helped to spur some kind of evolutionary change. And you can also take a look at these frequency, these histograms of thermal tolerance, upper thermal tolerance. And this is before selection. All the lines are mixed together, random. And this is after 6 generations of selection. The up-selected lines, you have a bimodal distribution here now. Two peaks on the thermal tolerance histogram. So these are the up selected lines and the low selected lines. So after just 6 generations, we had a obvious significant response to selection, an evolutionary response to selection as a result of variation in the original population in thermal tolerance, and that variation was heritable. So this is evolution by natural selection demonstrated in real time in the lab. And what are the practical conclusions of this? Well, they say, considering the rate at which global temperatures are increasing, the observed rates of adaptation, and the possible hard limit in upper thermal tolerance. In other words, they couldn't select for much greater thermal tolerance than just what they observed in this experiment, seemed to stop. Evolution seemed to stop after a very small response. Suggests a low potential for evolution to rescue tropical fish from climate change if those tropical fish are living at the edge of their thermal limits. And this is zebrafish, wild-caught zebrafish. Or in their little publicity blurb here, these results suggest that tropical fishes will struggle to adapt and pace with the current climate warming. Of course, this is only one species. We don't know what the case is for other species. All right, so take a look at this paper, which is posted to the website. A very interesting example of variation, heritability, selection, and evolutionary response in the lab.